Hello everyone! Today I'm going to be showing you how I do my gemstone paintings. Hopefully by the end of this tutorial you'll be able to paint your very own gemstone just like these ones here. If you're new to painting, what I would recommend doing is starting with a gemstone shape that is pretty simple, such as a circle or a square. And the reason for this is because the facets within those gemstones tend to be a little bit more regular and easy to paint, and oftentimes you can find an image of those shapes with very dramatic differences in color and shading. So that will make this process a little bit easier to do if it's your first time. So what I do next is I run a Google search for a cut of gemstone similar to the one that I will be painting. So in this case, the one that most closely resembles what I've drawn is a pear cut. And so I just searched for pear cut garnet. You could search pear cut ruby, pear cut sapphire, whatever. The color doesn't really matter because what we're going to be paying attention to when we look for a reference to use is how much light and dark the image has. So for example, if you look at this one here, you'll notice that it's quite dark. There are some highlights and there are some shadows and some dark and light in this image, but it's not exactly what I look for when I'm painting these. So you could, certainly paint this, but when it is on the page, these ones that have more of the dark color or too much light, they tend not to pop as much as ones, say like this one, or even like this one here, where you can see there's a lot of places where the light is reflecting off of the gemstone. There are some white bits, there are some really dark bits, and there's all sorts of shades in between. So that's what I'm looking for when I look for a reference image. Again, if you can't find one that is the color that you're looking for, it's not that big of a deal because what we're really focusing on is the light and shadow and everything in between. You want it to be pretty varied. So what I found that I liked was this one here. And so basically what I did is I just took this into Photoshop and I rotated it so that it was in the same orientation as what I'm going to be painting. And I just keep this up as a reference while I paint. So I came up with this design, and this is just my rough draft. And then what I did with this is I imported it into Adobe Illustrator and I cleaned up all of the lines so that it looks like this. If anybody is interested in learning how I do this part of the process where I clean up the lines, let me know and I can make a tutorial going over that as well. So here it is all printed out, and the first thing that I'm going to do here is to just paint in the gemstone with a light color. And the reason that I like to do this is because it's typically easier to paint a dark color over a light color than it is to paint a light color over a dark color. This, of course, will vary a bit depending on the medium that you choose to use for your painting. For example, what I'm using here is called gouache, and for those of you that don't know, gouache is a watercolor paint. But what is really nice about gouache is that depending on how much water you add, you can get it to behave a bit more like acrylic paints. And if you are new to painting, I would recommend starting with acrylics. In my opinion, they tend to be a lot more versatile than some of your other choices. It makes it a lot easier to paint, for example, light colors over dark colors, because acrylics tend to be quite opaque. But what's really nice about acrylics is that if you do want to water them down to sort of create a semi-transparent effect, that's also very easy to do. So for beginners, if you've never done anything like this, I think you'll find that working with acrylics will be the easiest way to start. So with your reference image up, start looking for geometric shapes that you can easily copy onto your gemstone. Now what I like to do is to start with some of the darker shapes that are around the outside of the gemstone, and the reason that I like to do this is because it provides a way for me to get the placement of these shapes a little bit better than if I were to, say, work from top to bottom. It's kind of a way for me to triangulate in, especially when I'm painting a shape like this. As you can see, my teardrop shape is not exactly the same shape as that pear cut gemstone, so I'm having to adjust my shapes a little bit so that they look correct. And if you were to choose, say, a circle or a square like I recommend doing if you've never done this before, it makes these shapes a little bit easier to paint because they're all going to be very symmetrical, they're all going to be pretty regular, and you won't have to do a whole lot of adjustment and you can just paint them straight on. So as you can see here, what I've essentially done is sort of create myself some reference points using these basic shapes that I see in my reference. I also try to save those really light sections for last, because what I do at the very end is attempt to create a sort of transparent look by painting a very thin layer over the top of those darker colors so that the darker colors show through. Another thing to keep in mind here is to try not to overthink what you're doing. It's essentially just a bunch of interconnected and overlapping geometric shapes, and it really isn't going to look like a gemstone until you're almost finished with it when you add those highlights and sort of finish up some of the finer details. Just recreate the shapes that you see in your reference to the best of your ability, and it will probably come out just fine in the end. You also want to keep it pretty simple when it comes to your color palette. For this painting, I only used 4 base colors. I used crimson, vermilion, white, and black. And then to create those shades in between, I simply mixed either the black with either of my red colors or the white with either of my red colors and painted those on accordingly. One thing that can really help with this is to paint one color at a time, or at least the majority of one color at a time. So for example, in your reference image, you might choose to start with the very dark red. So go around and paint in all of the areas that should be very dark red, and then move on to, let's say, the next lightest color, such as sort of like the mid-tone dark red. And you'll just go around your painting filling in all of the various colors this way. Again, don't be discouraged if you are looking at your painting and thinking that it looks nothing like a gemstone. Like I mentioned before, they typically won't look like what you want them to look like until you add those fine details at the very end. The other thing to keep in mind is that our brains are already primed to know this is a gemstone, so it doesn't have to be perfect. You will look at it and kind of fill in the blanks where they need to be filled in and recognize that this is a gemstone. You know, if you look at any of these paintings up close, you'll see things that are obviously not perfect and not quite matching up with the reference image. It doesn't really matter that you don't get this exactly perfect. The idea is to get it similar enough and let your brain kind of complete the illusion. So here we are at the end stage of our painting where we start to add those bright highlights that will really make our gemstone come to life. And I saved this for the end because I like to add a very thin layer of paint on top of some of the darker regions so that the dark will show through, giving it that impression of depth. Now this can be a little bit tricky, especially if you are using watercolors, or like in my case, if you decide to use gouache. And that's just because with the paint being so wet, it will start to mix layers of paint that you have underneath. So you have to get it at just the right consistency so that you're not overly sort of mixing the colors underneath with the colors on top, but enough to where you can get it to be a thin enough layer so that those colors show through. It is something that takes a little bit of trial and error. It requires a bit of practice. but it's not too hard once you get the hang of it. Also, don't be afraid to paint some of these regions entirely white, especially if they look that way in the reference image. It might seem a bit unnatural, but it'll make your painting look really nice. Alright, so there we have it. I hope this tutorial was helpful. I think the major takeaway here, if you're new to this, is to just keep it as simple as possible. These gemstones are basically just a collection of interconnected geometric shapes, and if you focus on one at a time and make sure that you get them in the right position and with relatively the right colors, then you should have a gemstone painting in no time.